In this problem, we're going to use the identities, Pythagorean identities, reciprocal identities, and quotient identities to find the secant and the tangent if we know that the sine is negative 2/3 and cosine is less than 0. So here, to figure this one out, we're going to start with our Pythagorean identity, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And the reason I want to find cosine is since I want to find secant, I know if I find cosine, I can reciprocate cosine to get secant. And I know that if I have cosine and sine, I can use the quotient identity sine over cosine is equal to tangent. So to start off, using this Pythagorean identity, I'm going to do negative 2/3 squared for my sine. So negative 2/3 squared plus cosine squared, which I don't know, is equal to 1. When we square, remember that squaring means a number times itself. So negative 2/3 times negative 2/3. A negative times a negative is a positive. And I know 2 times 2 is 4, and 3 times 3 is 9. But I want the cosine to be by itself, which means I have to move the 4/9 to the other side. So I'm going to subtract it to the other side, which means it's going to cancel out from here. And now over here, the thing I like about the Pythagorean identities is it always has a 1. And I can always change a 1 to a number over itself. So I can make that 1 9/9. And that makes my subtraction of fractions very easy. So now I have cosine squared theta is equal to 9 minus 4, which is 5/9. But I can't leave my cosine as a cosine squared. I have to take the square root. And I know when I do a square root, I do a plus or minus. Now I have cosine theta is equal to, I don't know square root 5, so I'm going to leave that square root 5. But I do know the square root of 9 is 3. Now here we wanted our secant. But we still have to figure out if our cosine's positive or negative. So that means I'm going to draw a little graph for myself. I know that sine is negative because it told me that the sine was negative 2/3. Sine is y, and y is negative in the third and the fourth quadrant. But it also told me this piece of information that cosine was less than 0, meaning cosine is also negative. And since cosine is x, that's negative in the second and the third quadrant. And since both of those happen in the third quadrant, that's how I know if my sine, cosine, tangent, everything is positive or negative. So here, since I'm in the third, cosine is negative in the third. So now I can use my cosine to reciprocate it and figure out what my secant is. So my secant of theta is the reciprocal of my cosine. Cosine was negative 5/3, so secant is going to be 3/negative root 5. And of course, I can't leave that with a square root on the bottom. So I'm going to multiply by square root 5. So secant is going to be 3 square root 5. Square root 5 times square root 5 is square root 25. And so that's just a 5. And making sure I put the negative back on there. Then finally, I want to get my tangent. And I know that my tangent is going to be my sine divided by my cosine. So I'm going to set that up for myself. So tangent. My sine is negative 2/3 over my cosine, which is negative 5, or square root 5 rather, over 3. And instead of thinking of it as a division problem, instead I can write it out without the fraction bar as a full division problem if this confuses me. So that means that I can write my tangent of theta is equal to negative 2/3 divided by negative 5/3. And that can help me to know which one to reciprocate. So here, my tangent theta is going to be negative 2/3 times, reciprocate that second one, 3/negative root 5. The 3's cancel out. And that's going to give me negative 2/negative root 5. Of course, the negatives can cancel out from the top and the bottom. And I don't want to leave that square root down there. So one more time, rationalize my denominator. So my tangent The two negatives are gone. It's going to be 2 root 5. Root 5 over times root 5 is root 25, which is just going to be a 5 there.